Who has the right to decide the next Dalai Lama, the sacred traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, or the iron grip of the Chinese Communist Party? This isn't just a spiritual dilemma, it's a geopolitical time bomb. A conflict where reincarnation is not just a religious idea, but a tool of global power. This is the story of one of the world's oldest spiritual legacies, under siege by one of the most powerful regimes on Earth. And right in the middle of it all, India, silent yet significant. This is part one of a two-part deep dive into the battle for Tibet's soul. For more than 6 centuries, the Dalai Lama has been more than a religious teacher. He is the living embodiment of compassion in Tibetan Buddhism, the reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of mercy. The title Dalai Lama was first bestowed in the 16th century, but the line of incarnations stretches back even earlier. Traditionally, when a Dalai Lama dies, the Panchen Lama, Tibet's second highest spiritual authority, helps locate the child believed to be his reincarnation. This child undergoes a rigorous series of tests, not just religious rituals, but deep spiritual signs and recognitions that are steeped in centuries of tradition. This isn't a democratic vote, nor is it a political appointment. It is by every standard a sacred search. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party, fresh off its Civil War victory, turned its gaze to Tibet. Just a year later, the People's Liberation Army marched into the region. Tibet, a nation with its own government, culture, religion, and borders, was suddenly absorbed into a rising empire. China framed it as a liberation, but Tibetans saw it as an invasion. By 1959, tensions exploded. Thousands of Tibetans rose up in a rebellion. The uprising failed. That same year, the 14th Dalai Lama, just 24 years old, fled Tibet. In disguise and under the protection of loyalists, he crossed the Himalayas and entered India. There, in Dharamshala, the Dalai Lama established the Central Tibetan Administration, often called the Tibetan Government in Exile. India granted him asylum, and over time, Dharamshala became the spiritual and political capital for millions of Tibetan exiles around the world. From this new base, the Dalai Lama didn't just lead the Tibetan resistance, he took Tibetan Buddhism global. While Beijing tried to erase him from history, he was winning Nobel Prizes and speaking at the UN. In 1995, the Dalai Lama identified a 6-year-old boy, Gedhun Choki Nyima, as the reincarnation of the 10th Panchen Lama. Within just 3 days of the announcement, the Chinese government abducted the child and his family. They were never seen again. In his place, China installed Gainkane Norbu, a boy trained by the state, loyal to the Communist Party. This was not just a kidnapping, it was a hostile takeover of Tibetan spirituality. Why does this matter so much? Because the Panchen Lama is traditionally responsible for finding the next Dalai Lama. By abducting the real one, China hopes to control the future of Tibetan Buddhism. They want a successor who isn't chosen by faith, but by fiat, a puppet in robes. To this day, the real Panchen Lama's whereabouts are unknown. The United Nations, Amnesty International, and Buddhist leaders worldwide have demanded information. But China remains silent. And for Tibetans, that silence echoes louder than any propaganda. Recently, the Dalai Lama made it crystal clear, only the Garden Phodrang Trust has the right to decide my reincarnation. The trust, founded in 1940s and re-established in exile, is the traditional custodian of the Dalai Lama's estate, both spiritual and temporal. It is not political, it is religious. But China doesn't agree. Beijing has passed a law requiring all reincarnations of living Buddhas to be approved by the state. Yes, a government document now claims authority over rebirth. Their justification: Tibet is part of China, and religion must serve the state. To China, the Dalai Lama is not a holy man, he's a threat, a symbol of Tibetan identity, resilience and resistance. So controlling his successor is not just a religious act, it's a political necessity. India gave shelter to the Dalai Lama, but history remembers silence more than sanctuary. In 1950, when Chinese troops invaded Tibet, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel wrote a letter to Prime Minister Nehru. His words were prophetic. Chinese communists are not socialists, they are expansionists. Tibet is a buffer, we must act. But Nehru, hoping for Asian solidarity and peace, ignored the warning. 12 years later, the 1962 Sino-Indian War shattered Nehru's dream. China attacked across Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh. India was caught unprepared and humiliated. Tibet had been the first domino, and India never saw it fall. Even today, India avoids making strong statements about the Dalai Lama's successor. Fearing China's backlash, it walks a diplomatic tightrope. But as history has shown, silence is not always neutral. Sometimes it's complicity. The world may soon witness something that has never happened in Tibetan Buddhism. 2 Dalai Lamas, one chosen by the traditional Tibetan religious system, and the other, handpicked by the Chinese Communist Party. This scenario is no longer hypothetical. The Chinese government has already stated that the 14th Dalai Lama's successor must be approved by the state through its own sanctioned institutions. Beijing plans to use the state-appointed Panchen Lama, Gyaltsen Norbu, the boy they raised after abducting the real one in 1995, to declare the next reincarnation. Meanwhile, the Garden Phodrang Trust, the Dalai Lama's spiritual authority in exile, will likely search for a reincarnation in a free country, perhaps even outside Tibet, possibly India or Mongolia. This spiritual split would have global implications. Temples across Asia would be torn in loyalty. Governments would be forced to choose between Beijing's approval or centuries-old Tibetan tradition. The average Buddhist believer would face a moral dilemma: faith or fear. This fracture would not just be a religious division, it would be the spiritual equivalent of a civil war. One child revered as a spiritual leader, the other paraded as a political trophy. The division would echo through Nepal, Bhutan, Mongolia, Japan, Korea, even the West. And yet, this is precisely what China is betting on: to confuse, divide, and conquer Tibetan Buddhism from the inside. China's control over reincarnation is not an isolated strategy. It's part of a broader campaign to control all religion. Under President Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party has rebranded itself not just as a political authority, but as a moral authority. Religion, under this vision, must serve the nation. It must be sinicized, remade in the image of communist ideology. Bibles are rewritten to reflect party values. Mosques are surveilled. Church crosses are replaced with flags. Even temples are forced to hold communist propaganda sessions. For Tibetan Buddhism, this means monks are required to denounce the Dalai Lama. Children are banned from attending monasteries, Tibetan texts are censored, and reincarnation itself must be approved by the State Religious Affairs Bureau. Internationally, China exports its state-controlled version of Buddhism by funding temples in Southeast Asia and hosting state-run religious summits. They aim to control not just Tibetan hearts, but global minds, a world where even enlightenment must be licensed. So the struggle over the next Dalai Lama is not just about a single figure. It's about whether any religion has the right to define its future without political interference. And as China's economic influence grows, many nations may be tempted to remain silent, or worse, endorse the state-chosen figure. But despite all their power, there's one thing the Chinese Communist Party can't fully conquer: private belief. Inside China, millions of Buddhists continue to secretly honor the Dalai Lama. Temples display hidden photos of him behind curtains. Followers whisper prayers in defiance. Some even cross the border illegally to seek teachings from Tibetan monks in India or Nepal. This underground network of believers reveals the limits of surveillance, because faith cannot be scanned, banned, or erased. Even among party members, stories have emerged of quiet reverence for Buddhist philosophy. And it's not just Tibetans. In Han Chinese communities, Buddhism is growing, especially among the youth disillusioned with materialism. Xi Jinping fears this, not because he's afraid of prayer beads, but because he knows that a spiritual awakening can become political. In history, religion has overthrown empires and inspired revolutions. From the Falun Gong movement to the Catholic Church in Poland, belief has always been a quiet battlefield. So the Dalai Lama, even in exile, remains the most dangerous symbol of resistance. not because he calls for violence, but because he inspires conscience. In the heart of this conflict stands India, the land where the Buddha attained enlightenment and where the Dalai Lama found refuge. India's role is not just diplomatic, it is deeply symbolic. India hosts the Tibetan government in exile in Dharamshala. It trains Tibetan monks. It holds the trust that will likely identify the next Dalai Lama. Yet, in international forums, India remains cautious. It rarely speaks on Tibet for fear of angering Beijing, especially after border clashes in Doklam and Ladakh. But this neutrality cannot last. When the two Dalai Lamas emerge, India will be forced to recognize one, and the implications will be profound. If India supports the spiritual successor chosen by Tibetan tradition, it will anger China, but gain the admiration of millions of Buddhists worldwide, including in Bhutan, where Vajrayana Buddhism is the state religion, Nepal, with deep Himalayan traditions, Mongolia, a historic ally of the Dalai Lama, Japan, and South Korea, with Mahayana Buddhist populations, Sri Lanka, home to Theravada Buddhism and a growing spiritual movement. It's not just religious support, it's soft power. India can emerge as the true guardian of Buddhist heritage, a civilizational superpower grounded in spiritual legitimacy. On the other hand, if India remains silent, it loses that opportunity forever. And worse, it risks betraying the very ideals of freedom it claims to uphold. In a world where China claims to control enlightenment, India must choose whether it controls its own conscience. Perhaps the most profound twist in this entire saga comes from the Dalai Lama himself. In recent years, he has stated that he might not reincarnate at all. He has suggested the tradition of Dalai Lama may have served its purpose and can now be respectfully retired. Other times, he has hinted he may reincarnate as a woman, or that he may return in a free country outside China's grasp. Each statement carries spiritual weight, but also political brilliance. If the Dalai Lama reincarnates outside China, it renders Beijing's puppet meaningless. If he doesn't reincarnate at all, it leaves their plan with no target. If he becomes a woman, it challenges centuries of patriarchy in Tibetan society and opens a new era of interpretation. In every scenario, he holds the final move. It's a spiritual checkmate. By refusing to play by China's rules, he shows the world that true faith is not confined to a throne, a temple, or a certificate. It's an inner truth. And perhaps that is his ultimate message, that the fight for Tibet is not about geography, but about awakening, about freedom, not of borders, but of the soul.